World of Warcraft has over 7 million subscribers 20 years later. How do we get to that? What does it mean for the state of the game now and in the future? And what sort of drama can we start by saying it's all thanks to classic art? No, it's thanks to the Dragonflight changes. No, it's thanks to the World Soul Saga announcement. No, it's definitely the Azerothian archives. Hey, it's Soul with another video. It's going to be a little bit light on the B-roll as usual, so enjoy the audio and this right here. Today we're going to talk about the state of WoW, now that we have these unofficial but corroborated numbers, a factual graph presented by the Blizzard team, and of course we have a bunch of conclusions and anecdotes to justify our feelings like it's a warm and fuzzy blanket. So if you don't mind, hit the like button, subscribe for more WoW coverage, catch me live on Twitch, and let's look at what this video is going to be based off of. The other week, the Game Developers Conference took place, where Big Dog executive John Haidt was a speaker. It was a very transparent presentation on the history of the Warcraft franchise as a whole, with a focus on the World of Warcraft, what worked and what didn't, and it included a few graphs of its subscriber numbers since the beginning of the so-called borrowed power era, starting with Legion. I'm going to move us over to the last graph that reveals to us a lot of how WoW has been doing. Guesswork from Bellular Gaming and source confirmation from Just Corden tells us that at the moment there are a little over 7 million subscribers of the World of Warcraft between the classic and the modern versions. There are going to be a lot of conclusions and guesswork on my part as I jump around on this timeline, so I'm going to start right here. It's 2024 right now, and this game is going to be 20 years old in November. Now, there are a lot of massive games out there that command a lot of authority, like League of Legends, or Fortnite, or Final Fantasy XIV, or Grand Theft Auto. There's like a bunch of them. World of Warcraft, though, can claim what I think is a pretty exceptional status for a very old MMORPG that still commands these kinds of numbers. Other games consider themselves successful with like just a fraction of those numbers. Many MMOs, they haven't nearly lasted this long, and yet 20 years later, here we are. Looking at the graph, the first peak marks Legion, which launched August 2016, and it came from what looks like a pretty low point when Warlords of Draenor was dragging itself out of a year-long tier with, well, virtually no updates after the launch of Hellfire Citadel a whole year prior. 8 years later, though, after a few roller coasters, the game is still at 7 million subscribers. We're going to take a closer look at that soon, but for now, just kind of think about that for a second. Like, there are still a lot of people today who enjoy World of Warcraft in some way, shape, or form. Aside from the expansion box, a WoW sub gets you so much more value than it did 8 years ago, with additional expansion content and the classic eras to enjoy these days. I find that to be extremely impressive for a 20-year-old MMO that still runs a subscription model. But anyway, let's start telling some stories as we go down the timeline kind of in order. These are more or less just my conclusions based on observations. I'm gonna probably miss a few details. I'm just trying to go through this a little bit quickly. Legion, like any expansion, got a lot of initial interest before it faded away. I'd say one of the biggest demographics of expansion buyers are the fair weather fans, seasonal ex-players who, no matter what, they're just going to play for like no longer than a month. They're just here to like check it out. And well, I just think it's important to point out that the number of ex-WoW players, it absolutely dwarfs current WoW players, and of course, by its nature, that number is only going to grow. WoW has claimed well over 100 million accounts, and even if half of those were bots, that's a ton of people who have at some point played the game, and they become kind of automatically a target audience. So it's important for the team to give a good first impression, an appetite-inducing campaign, hype to get folks excited to buy the box, even if they're not going to stick around for very long. Of course, though, reality sets in, folks get their jollies and then they stop playing, or like another new game comes out, or maybe the dissatisfaction of RNG legendaries brought people down, or maybe Mythic Plus, its first iteration of it, didn't turn out as fun as they hoped. Maybe the new dungeons and the Mage Tower that are introduced a little bit later on, maybe they kept people hanging for a little bit longer, but not quite long enough. Maybe the legendary vendor was enough to get players to hop back in, at least for a time. Or maybe this happens to be the same point after BlizzCon and the WoW Classic announcement that some people wanted to check in and see how the modern game was doing. Oh, actually, it's not even the modern game, it was the only game. Moving on to Battle for Azeroth, notice that the trending line both up and down is sharper than that of Legion. I remember a lot of reports and comments over how Azeroth gear just didn't really work out, and that the story didn't feel compelling enough to be one that people wanted to really stick around and be a part of. You know, something not my war chief and all that. If Legion wore people out over time, folks checked out of BFA even faster. 8.2 and Azeroth essences, maybe it did the WoW team a few favors, if only to maybe slow the attrition down, but the middle of BFA also marked when World of Warcraft forever changed. It became more than just the game by itself, but it now also introduced the classic era as part of its lineup. And the gains obviously can't be dismissed. It's like pretty much a new game launch that tapped into, again, that massive market that I mentioned earlier, the ex-WoW player. Its launch opens a box that can never ever be closed, where the investments into World of Warcraft are now split between two somewhat different audiences, but the returns are looked at with this single metric. A WoW sub is just a WoW sub. Your money pays for what, like the creation of mythic raids and new pets and hardcore classic and the super bloom and even season of discovery. So regardless of the version that you play or the features that you care about, you support the game and every version of it is better for it. Anyway, back to the original classic launch, the behavior of a classic player, it's pretty much like any other, fair weather fans and curious people. They came in to check things out, they got their nostalgia hit, and then they left for whatever reason. I mean, it could have been the difficulties of getting into the server that they wanted to get into before they started to give up. There are a bunch of reasons. If we're to say that in mid-2019, Battle for Azeroth players mostly bottomed out and classic WoW carried the count towards the end of the year, then we'll also conclude that between the Shadowlands announcement and the pandemic shutdown, WoW Classic shed maybe half of its initial players. That's not a bad thing at all, because obviously the other half stayed in the meantime, and I'm sure there are people, both coming and going simultaneously. It's just the nature of what we've been seeing for years. Now, I'd say that between the pandemic shutdowns and classic phases and BFA promotions, 2020 was sort of a unpredictable time for WoW and just gaming in general. While waiting for Shadowlands, we can play Classic in the meantime, or when Classic looked like it was having a downturn, hey, let's check out the modern game. We hear a lot about how Blizzard ought to, quote, fix the game, that doing this or that is going to save WoW. And oftentimes in those conversations, we hear passionate fans talk about what should change. WoW Classic is Blizzard's way of saying, instead of changing today's game, let's just give yesterday's game back to you. And I'll probably return to this conversation a few times, but anyway, let's move on. There can probably be a lot of books written about the behind-the-scenes development of Shadowlands, and I'd bet that a few, if any of them, would be full of like puppies and positivity and feel-good stories. Shadowlands did get a nice bump during its launch, but notice that it's not the same sized bump that BFA or Legion got, and yet Shadowlands broke sales records. We can make up a few conclusions that might be somewhat true, like we can claim that fewer people from the demographic of non-subscribers were even interested in Shadowlands. A chunk of the WoW Classic demographic who are technically current subscribers already, maybe they were interested enough in Shadowlands to pick it up. I found 2021 to make sense here on this graph, but it's also pretty interesting. Like, it's kind of an odd way to describe like one of their first periods, but anyway, the first season of Shadowlands, it was extremely long, taking nearly 8 months to get through, with only a minor bump thanks to the release of TBC Classic. I'm willing to bet that the story isn't so much that Burning Crusade Classic didn't bring players back, but it was more like Shadowlands was approaching like a free fall velocity, right? We could also kind of claim that the classic audience might have been mostly milked over their nostalgia, and we could only expect really diehard fans to stick around, at least for the time being. It was also this time when, between the reception of Season 2 Shadowlands and the Blizzard lawsuit, WoW was just taking one gut punch after another, which they're still trying to recover from, I think. Shadowlands mostly bottomed out in late 2022. Covenant switching and renown boosting became kind of a thing. The expansion's problems were fundamental, but they were slowly being chipped away in favor of new philosophies that would be reflected in its next expansion. Over at Blizzard, the old guard was leaving, new faces were in charge, and a Microsoft bio indicated even more changes incoming. The announcement of Dragonflight in April alone seemed to have started up some kind of momentum, but here's something really interesting to look at. Wrath Classic launched in September of 2022, bringing with it changes that would make this version of Wrath quite a bit different from the original. Let's also look at Dragonflight's launch, which is very peculiar. Like, if you look closely, you notice that there's a first upward slope, which to me looks like actually the Wrath Classic launch. And then it's followed up by this second but slower slope that peaks after 2023. After 2023, this is like, a few months after Dragonflight launches. That's kind of weird, huh? I'm gonna guess that the first day of Dragonflight is like somewhere here, but the momentum keeps rising. Now this tells me a few things: that the demographic of ex-WoW players is or was very, very cautious about reinvesting in WoW thanks to Shadowlands or the lawsuit or wherever their reasons were, or maybe they weren't so much wowed by the Drakthir or Evoker class at first, or the story and the cinematic reveal, or maybe they were pissed that there was a lack of Tuskar allied race. No reason is too petty. It's already public knowledge that Dragonflight did not sell as well as Shadowlands. But let's take a look at another slide that shows another interesting bit of info: the WoW team's projections of how subcounts would look between Shadowlands and the Classic era games. Now, they didn't factor in the TBC Classic bump, nor the poor reception of Shadowlands up to Season 2, and the press around Blizzard at the time probably only helped to magnify players' dissatisfactions. There's almost no question that those who are part of that downward trend are customers that are lost to not just WoW, but probably all Blizzard games. But there's another conclusion we can draw. The rate at which folks signed on for Dragonflight, it came at a slower rate, but so did the attrition of people leaving. The stability was bragged by the team back when it was first reported. And I think this part of the audience here is comprised of people who thought that they would be leaving the game forever. So maybe among this audience are those who have kind of gotten over it. They've forgiven Blizzard and they're on this slow path to rebuilding their faith in the team and the game. 2023 was more than just that, as they released more versions of Classic with hardcore stuff and Season of Discovery. I'd credit the majority of the upward trend later in the year towards the Classic era, notably with Season of Discovery with its refreshing gameplay to change up the familiar feelings of vanilla. This came shortly after the first BlizzCon since 2019 and the announcement of the World Soul Saga, with many well-received changes and of course Chris Messin's return, and with him renewed hopes of a winning story. Most recently, the Plunderstorm is, it's whatever you feel like saying it is, but on top of that, it's also the first World of Warcraft feature that's accessible to all of its subscribers regardless of what the preferred game is. Now, a bit of a rewind too, notice that the downward trend after Dragonflight's release is far less steep than that of previous expansions. A part of it is because the peak isn't all that high either, but I have a feeling, it's just a guess, right, that there's some attrition happening here between the usual trend of people dipping out and others becoming curious and checking things out. Like, hey, 10.1.5 or whatever has a whole last specialization coming out, and look at all these neat things that are coming in month after month with the trading post, and there's like one promo after another. Despite what some may claim, Dragonflight has been an expansion that keeps on giving, from rewards to activities, with the hopes that in future expansions all this gets improved on. World of Warcraft has proven that it's been a very resilient game over the past 20 years. It's weathered the evolution of gaming outside of its little bubble. It's outlasted and outperformed tens of other MMOs who've tried to get a piece of that pie. It's endured brand new game genres, console generations, and most importantly, it survived its own freaking mistakes. And in the nature of this business, there's more of those mistakes to come. I'd say in hindsight, WoW is thriving because it's both embracing its past and investing into its future. Without the Classic era games, WoW would probably be in serious trouble today. But without change or evolution, we probably wouldn't have Season of Discovery. We wouldn't see risk taking, and the game would probably be in the same sucky situation. We can draw some broad conclusions now that we have this graph thing to look back on. I mentioned this earlier, that there are plenty of folks who talk about, how to fix WoW. That WoW shouldn't be like this, it should be like that, because that is what the players want. That is what would make the game, less complex and overwhelming. But there's one observation that I've made that is much louder than any rhetoric I've heard, no matter who it came from, and it's that players like it when the game has something for them to do. For example, multiple raid and dungeon difficulties. Plenty of folks say that that's bad for the game, that it's too much, that it whittles down how epic those experiences are. Like we feel like we have to do all of it to gear up and be optimal or whatever, and that the casuals should just get good, or that the elitists, they should just relax and not try so hard. And yet multiple difficulties endure in this game because in the end, it gets more people playing. Like, hey, retail should be more like WoW Vanilla. Well, here's WoW Classic. There you go. And the people who want it now, they have it. Where WoW can improve, it ought to be, I think. Like talent systems, professions, UI, and account-wide features, hey, let's freaking go. But when WoW can add a feature instead of modifying or changing an existing feature that might alienate players, yeah, they're going to do that too, because in the end, kind of obvious, they just want more players. As fans, we tend to champion features at the expense of others because we're also kind of sort of playing armchair dev. We're trying to find this sort of equivalent exchange that in order to have a winner, there's got to be a loser. If we want that one feature, we're going to have to sacrifice a raid tier and all that. And even developers admit that they have to make hard choices and cut features in order to ship a product. If the Legion through Shadowlands expansions were the era of borrowed power, between Dragonflight and the classic era games and the World Soul Saga, we're just warming up to this play how you like era with a variety of WoW versions and experiences to choose from the past to remixes of the past to the uncertain future with, again, a bunch of features to suit your playstyle. And after 20 years, that demographic I talked about with ex-WoW players who aren't currently subbed, it's bigger than it's ever been. And again, it's only going to grow. So it makes a whole lot of sense that we're seeing that the WoW team is offering a character boost in every version of the upcoming War Within expansion. It's an invitation to almost immediately dive into the newest thing that WoW has to offer, with also 4 or so other flavors of WoW to enjoy. The state of WoW is the entire state of all of WoW. It's not just our favorite or the one that we think is the most important, and the state is looking pretty damn good. From the looks of the graph, the mood around Season of Discovery is just starting to cool a little bit, but we just had 10.2.6 and Plunderstorm. Another SOD phase is starting next week during Dragonflight's lull, but not really lull period, and Season 4 of Dragonflight's coming. There's another Dragonflight patch coming around the corner. There's the War Within Alpha, like that's pretty imminent, and then 10.2.7 with a Season of Discovery phase, and I think somewhere in there Cataclysm Classic not long after. It's too simple, I guess, to say that the state of WoW is good. I should say that the state of WoW is more like multi-pronged aggression. Like they're not sitting on their hands, coasting their fame. The hubris has become hunger, and hopefully that turns into better experiences for us. And I'm pretty gassed. Thanks for listening. Leave a comment, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.